You've been here too long. I suspect you're waiting for your fellow gangs to rob the place.
There is no gang. I am just resting. Am I being detained for resting?
I don't think you came here to rest. I know a lookout when I see one.
The silence of the New Orleans Botanical Gardens was the only thing keeping Dwayne Philips sane after 6 months of living a double life that would have broken a weaker man. He was sitting on a wooden bench surrounded by the heavy scent of blooming magnolias and the distant sound of water trickling through a stone fountain, trying to remember what it felt like to be himself instead of the criminal character he played every single day for the FBI. It was supposed to be his day off, a rare moment where he could turn off the constant paranoia and just breathe the humid air without looking over his shoulder for drug dealers or arms traffickers who wanted him dead. But peace is a fragile thing in a city that never really sleeps, and Dwayne's peace was about to be shattered by a man who saw skin color before he saw a badge. Before we dive into this intense encounter that changed 2 lives forever, I want to know where you guys are watching from in the world right now. Please drop your location in the comment section below because it is always amazing to see how far these stories travel. The heat in New Orleans was thick enough to chew on, hanging low over the gardens like a wet blanket that muffled the sounds of the city outside the high fences. Dwayne had chosen this specific spot because it was hidden away from the main paths, a little alcove where the shadows of the giant oak trees provided cover and the Spanish moss draped down like old gray curtains. He was wearing a simple gray t-shirt and loose running shorts, looking like any other man trying to escape the oppressive afternoon sun, but his mind was still running through the details of the operation he was spearheading. He closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the bench, letting the tension drain out of his shoulders for the first time in weeks. He did not know that he was being watched. High above him, tucked discreetly under the overhang of a wooden gazebo roof, a security camera with a hanging middle angle was recording every second of his rest. The red light on the device blinked silently, a digital witness that would soon become the most important piece of evidence in a career-ending disaster. Dwayne had noticed the camera when he first sat down because his training forced him to notice everything, but he dismissed it because he was not doing anything wrong. He was just a man sitting on a bench. The crunch of heavy boots on gravel broke the silence. Dwayne did not open his eyes immediately because he hoped whoever it was would just walk past and leave him to his meditation. But the footsteps did not pass him by. They slowed down and then stopped right in front of his bench with a deliberate heaviness that screamed authority. The birds that had been chirping in the bushes suddenly went quiet, as if they sensed a predator entering the clearing. Dwayne opened his eyes slowly and looked up to see a police officer standing there with his thumbs hooked into his duty belt. The officer was a man named Francis, and he looked like he had been looking for a fight all morning and had finally found a target that he thought was easy enough to bully. Francis was not a large man, but he carried himself with an inflated sense of importance, his chest puffed out and his chin tilted up as he stared down at Dwayne through mirrored sunglasses that hid his eyes. The uniform was tight, the badge on his chest was polished to a shine, and the way he stood with his legs apart blocked Dwayne's view of the fountain. There was a long silence where neither man spoke, but the air between them crackled with an unspoken tension that felt sharper than a knife. Dwayne stayed seated, keeping his body language relaxed and non-threatening, but his mind instantly shifted gears from vacation mode back to survival mode. He analyzed the threat in front of him in a split second, noting the officer's hand hovering near his pepper spray and the way his jaw was clenched tight. Francis finally spoke, and his voice was a dry rasp that sounded like sandpaper dragging across concrete. He did not say hello or ask how the day was going. He went straight to an accusation that made absolutely no sense. He told Dwayne that he had been watching him for 20 minutes and that Dwayne had been sitting there for too long without moving. Dwayne blinked, trying to process the logic of being accused of sitting on a bench in a public garden where the entire purpose was to sit and enjoy nature. He remained calm, his voice steady and low as he informed the officer that he was simply resting and enjoying the quiet before heading back home. He made sure to keep his hands visible on his knees because he knew how quickly these situations could go wrong if he made a sudden movement. Francis was not interested in explanation. He took a step closer, invading Dwayne's personal space, and the smell of stale coffee and aggression wafted off him. He pointed a finger at Dwayne and declared that he knew exactly what was going on, claiming that Dwayne was not resting, but was actually scouting the location. The officer spun a wild theory right there in the garden, saying that he suspected Dwayne was waiting for his fellow gangs to arrive so they could rob the tourists who wandered into this secluded section of the park. It was laughable, but Dwayne did not laugh because he saw the seriousness in Francis's face. This man had created a narrative in his head based purely on prejudice, and he was determined to make reality fit his story no matter how absurd it sounded. The security camera above them continued to record, capturing the stark contrast between the calm, seated black man and the agitated white officer looming over him. Dwayne slowly shook his head and tried to de-escalate the situation by pointing out that there were no tourists around to rob and that he didn't even have a bag with him. He spoke clearly, ensuring that if anyone was listening, they would hear a rational man talking to an irrational one. But Francis was beyond listening. He was on a power trip that was fueled by the heat and his own ego. He accused Dwayne of having weapons concealed in his waistband and demanded that Dwayne stand up and put his hands against the rough bark of the oak tree. Do you think you could remain calm if someone accused you of a crime just for sitting down? Type yes or no in the comments, because the level of patience Dwayne had to display here was superhuman. Dwayne did not stand up immediately because he knew his rights and he knew that he had done nothing to warrant a search. He asked Francis if he was being detained and on what grounds, a question that usually makes bad cops pause, but it only seemed to make Francis angrier. The officer's face turned a shade of red that matched the blooming flowers behind him as he shouted that his suspicion was enough grounds. He claimed that people like Dwayne didn't just come to botanical gardens to smell the roses and that he knew a lookout when he saw one. The mention of people like Dwayne hung in the humid air, a heavy and ugly phrase that confirmed everything Dwayne suspected about why this was happening. It wasn't about safety and it wasn't about the law. It was about a man with a badge wanting to assert dominance over a man he deemed beneath him. Dwayne felt a flash of anger, a hot spark in his chest, but he shoved it down deep because he knew that reacting with anger would only give Francis the excuse he needed to use force. Francis unclipped the radio from his shoulder and called into dispatch, his voice loud and dramatic as he reported a suspicious individual who was refusing to comply and potentially hostile. He requested backup, painting a picture of a dangerous confrontation that simply did not exist. Dwayne listened to the lies spilling out of the radio and realized that this officer was digging his own grave, but he had to make sure he survived long enough to see the man fall into it. The security camera caught the moment Francis put his hand on his holster, the leather creaking loudly in the quiet garden. It was a threat, plain and simple. He was signaling that he was ready to introduce violence into a peaceful afternoon. Dwayne knew that if he reached for his own identification now, Francis might claim he saw a gun and pull the trigger. It was a deadly game of Simon Says where one wrong move meant death. Dwayne decided to move very slowly. He narrated his actions, telling Francis exactly what he was going to do before he did it, speaking in the calm, authoritative tone of someone who had been in high-pressure situations that would make Francis wet his pants. He told the officer that he was going to stand up slowly and that he was going to reach into his back pocket to show him something that would clear this whole misunderstanding up. Francis yelled at him to stop moving, his hand tightening on the grip of his weapon. He screamed that if Dwayne moved his hand behind his back, he would drop him right there on the gravel. The birds in the trees had fled long ago, leaving the two men alone in a bubble of hostility. Dwayne froze. He sat there with his hands raised slightly, palms open, looking Francis directly in the mirrored sunglasses. He asked Francis to look at him properly, to really look at him and ask himself if he was making a mistake. He asked the officer if he was willing to risk his career on a hunch that was driven by nothing but bias. For a second, Francis hesitated. The unwavering confidence in Dwayne's voice was not the voice of a nervous criminal or a street thug. It was the voice of a man who held power. But Francis was too far gone, too committed to his own mistake to back down now. He stepped forward and grabbed Dwayne's arm, jerking him roughly off the bench. The physical contact was the crossing of a line. Dwayne did not resist the pull, allowing himself to be hauled up, but he kept his balance perfect. Francis spun him around and shoved him toward the tree, kicking his legs apart. He started patting Dwayne down aggressively, his hands searching for the weapon he was so sure existed. He found nothing at the waist. He found nothing at the ankles. Then Francis's hand brushed against the back pocket of Dwayne's shorts. He felt the outline of a leather wallet, but it was thicker than a normal wallet. It had a metal weight to it. "I knew it," Francis hissed, triumph dripping from his voice. He thought he had found a small concealed pistol or a knife. He ripped the object out of Dwayne's pocket, ready to wave it in the air as proof of his superior police instincts. But when he pulled it out and flipped it over, the sun caught the object and sent a blinding reflection right into his eyes. It wasn't a gun. It wasn't a knife. It was a leather bifold with a gold badge embedded in the center. And below the badge were the bold, unmistakable letters, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The world seemed to stop spinning for Francis. The silence that followed was heavier than the heat. Francis stood there holding the badge, his mouth slightly open, his brain trying to process the information that his eyes were seeing. He looked from the badge to Dwayne and then back to the badge. The color drained from his face so fast it looked like he was about to faint. The arrogance that had coated him like armor just seconds ago shattered into a million pieces, leaving behind a terrified man who realized he had just assaulted a federal agent. Dwayne turned around slowly. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to be aggressive. He simply adjusted his shirt, brushed the dust off his arm where Francis had grabbed him, and looked at the officer with a mixture of pity and steel. He reached out his hand, palm up, waiting for his badge to be returned. Francis's hand was shaking. The tremor started in his fingers and traveled up his arm until his whole body seemed to vibrate with the realization of his catastrophe. He handed the badge back to Dwayne as if it were made of burning coal. He tried to speak, to stammer out an apology, to say that he was just doing his job and being careful, but his throat was so dry that only a squeak came out. Dwayne took the badge and tucked it calmly back into his pocket. He told Francis that he wasn't a gang member scouting for a robbery. He told him he was an agent who had spent the last 6 months dismantling actual gangs, and that the only criminal he had seen in the park today was the man standing in front of him who had just violated a citizen's civil rights. Just then, the sound of sirens cut through the air. The backup Francis had called was arriving. 2 more police cruisers skidded to a halt on the nearby access road, and 4 officers jumped out, hands on their holsters, ready for the hostile situation Francis had described. They ran into the garden clearing, expecting to see Francis wrestling a suspect to the ground. Instead, they saw Francis looking like he was about to vomit, and a calm black man standing with his arms crossed, looking unimpressed. The supervising sergeant, a man with gray hair and a no-nonsense attitude, walked up and looked between the 2 men. He asked Francis what was going on and where the weapon was. Francis couldn't answer. He was paralyzed. Dwayne answered for him. He introduced himself, stated his rank and agency, and informed the sergeant that his officer had just profiled, harassed, and assaulted an undercover federal agent on government property. The sergeant's eyes went wide. He looked at Francis, who was staring at his boots, unable to make eye contact with anyone. The sergeant asked Francis if this was true. Francis mumbled something about a mistake, about suspicious behavior, but the excuse sounded pathetic even to his own ears. Dwayne then pointed up. He pointed directly at the wooden overhang of the gazebo. He told the sergeant that they didn't need to argue about what happened because the security camera with the hanging middle angle had seen everything. He explained that the camera would show him sitting peacefully, Francis approaching aggressively, the lack of provocation, and the physical assault. The mention of the camera was the final nail in the coffin. Francis looked up at the device, the little red light blinking like a judgment, and he knew it was over. Dwayne demanded that the footage be pulled immediately. He wasn't going to let this get swept under the rug. He wasn't going to let Francis go back to the station and write a false report to cover his tracks. He wanted the evidence secured now. The sergeant, realizing the gravity of the situation and the potential lawsuit that was brewing, agreed immediately. They walked to the main administrative building of the gardens, a somber procession with Dwayne in the lead and Francis trailing behind like a man walking to the gallows. The park manager was confused but helpful, bringing them into the security room and pulling up the feed from camera 04. The room was cool and dark, lit only by the glow of the monitors. Everyone stood in silence as the video played. It was undeniable. The screen showed the peaceful scene of Dwayne resting. It showed Francis storming in. It showed the aggressive body language, the finger pointing, the way Dwayne remained calm and compliant. It showed Francis grabbing him without cause. And it showed the moment the badge came out, the moment Francis's career evaporated. Watching the footage was agonizing for Francis. He had to watch himself being a bully in high definition. He had to see the exact moment he let his prejudice override his training. There was no audio on this specific playback, but the images spoke louder than any words could. The gang narrative he had invented fell apart completely. There was no one else around. There was no scouting. There was just harassment. The sergeant turned off the monitor and turned to Francis. He didn't yell. He was too professional for that, and perhaps too disappointed. He simply asked for Francis's badge and gun. Right there in the security office, surrounded by the smell of floor wax and electronics, Francis had to unbuckle his belt. The heavy equipment that he used to intimidate people was stripped away from him piece by piece. He placed his gun on the desk. He unpinned the badge from his chest, the badge he had tarnished, and laid it down next to the weapon. He was no longer an officer of the law. He was just a man who had made a terrible, hateful choice. The sergeant informed Francis that he was suspended effective immediately pending the formal termination hearing, but everyone in the room knew there would be no coming back from this. Assaulting a federal agent is a federal crime, and even if Dwayne decided not to press charges to protect his cover, the department would cut Francis loose to save themselves. Francis was escorted out of the building, not to his patrol car, but to the passenger seat of another officer's vehicle to be driven home. He didn't look back. He didn't say a word. He just slumped his shoulders and walked out into the heat that didn't seem to bother him anymore because he was numb. Dwayne stayed behind for a moment with the sergeant. The sergeant apologized profusely, expressing his embarrassment for his officer's behavior. Dwayne accepted the apology, but offered a piece of advice. He told the sergeant to train his men better, to teach them that respect isn't something you demand with a badge, but something you earn by treating people like human beings. He told him that the next man Francis harassed might not have been a federal agent, just an innocent father or a student, and that's who really needed protection. Dwayne walked out of the office and back into the gardens. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the grass. He walked back to the bench where it all started. He sat down in the same spot, took a deep breath, and listened. The birds had returned. The fountain was still trickling. The peace that had been stolen from him slowly began to return. He closed his eyes again, but this time he wasn't just resting. He was thankful. He was thankful that he had the training to handle the situation without getting hurt. He was thankful for that security camera that hung at just the right angle to catch the truth. And he was thankful that, at least for today, one bad apple had been removed from the streets, making the city a tiny bit safer for the people who didn't carry badges. Dwayne stayed there until the sun went down, a silent guardian in the garden, watching the light fade and feeling the cool evening breeze finally wash away the heat of the day. He knew that tomorrow he would have to go back to his dangerous undercover work, back to the lies and the criminals. But for now, he enjoyed the simple, honest victory of justice being served. The story of Francis serves as a harsh reminder that authority without integrity is nothing but bullying, and that you never truly know who you are talking to. It costs nothing to be kind, but it cost Francis everything to be cruel. As Dwayne finally stood up to leave, the security camera's red light blinked one last time in the twilight, the silent hero of the day, continuing its watch over the empty bench and the quiet gardens. Dwayne walked to his car, not a hero in a cape, but a man who stood his ground, started his engine, and drove off into the New Orleans night, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring.